Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining today with the newest Software Test Professionals Community webinar. My name is Rick Bauckham. I'm the Director of Interactive Communications here at STP. And today we're really excited. I'm really happy about this topic. It's, of course, two popular topics together, and I'm looking forward to it. Today's webinar is Let's Get Real About Test Automation Using a Context-Driven Approach. And our speaker today is Lee Barnes, who hails from Chicago. So we're gonna join Lee in here in just a moment. Just a few quick announcements before we get started. One thing we wanted to let you guys know about, we're also very excited to announce that we will be in Arlington, Virginia from October 22nd through 25th. This is in the Washington, D.C. metro area for our next Software Test Professionals Conference. STPCon is a great place to come and learn about many different testing topics, including test automation and context-driven testing. We're going to be at the Sheraton Pentagon City Hotel there in Arlington. Right now, the Community Advisory Board, which is a board of practitioners that we use to review sessions and make suggestions on sessions and workshops, they are actually reviewing all of the submissions that we receive for this fall, and they are selecting the program as we speak. But if you'd like to go learn a little bit more about the conference, where it is, and everything like that, you can go to stpcon.com and learn more. We also have another webinar coming up on May 23rd. It's going to be on performance engineering with James Pulley. James is a regular speaker for us and kind of a real performance guru. James, along with Mark Tomlinson, run a podcast called Perf Bites that usually broadcasts live from the conference. So you should check this one out. We do not have the full details up on the website yet. We're waiting on those from James. But as soon as those are up, we will actually put the webinar up and it'll be ready for registration. Again, take a look for that, and you'll also just want to pay attention to email because we'll be announcing this webinar through our email system. We'll also be talking about it on Twitter as well. So stay tuned for that. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. All the attendees will remain muted. Please type your questions into the questions panel to be answered at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make it available to you probably after Friday. We will send out an email with the information on how to link, how to get to the actual recording of this webinar. So we are also on, of course, Twitter at SoftwareTestPro. We usually use the hashtag STP webinar for these webinars. And as you can see here, we also have Lee's Twitter account. If you would please, if he passes on some good nuggets of wisdom to you, please give him credit for that. That's always important. So let's go ahead and get started today. I'm gonna introduce Lee for us here. Again, we're doing the topic of let's get real about test automation using context-driven approach. So Lee has over 20 years of software and quality testing experience with focus on automation and performance testing. As founder and CTO of Utopia Solutions, Lee is responsible for the firm's delivery of software quality solutions, which include process improvement, test automation, performance management, and mobile quality. He speaks frequently on software testing related topics, including well-received sessions at STPCon, Star East, Quest, and many local testing and corporate events. I know we've always enjoyed having Lee at STPCon, and we hope to see him at a future one as well. Lee, I just want to go ahead and welcome you to the webinar.
Thanks, Rick, and thank you everyone for attending today. Rick, I think you'll need to make me the presenter.
You bet. There we go. I'm going to do that. How are the Cubs doing so far this year?
Not bad, not bad.
Yeah.
I'm a Sox fan, but
White Sox, huh? All right. Well, enjoy, and we will talk to you guys at the end of the webinar. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about getting real about test automation by taking a context-driven approach. I often talk about more technical topics like framework design or something along those lines, but the reality is, if you're taking the wrong approach, it will put you on a path that not even the best architected framework can save you from. So for today, I've got maybe 40 minutes of content. We should have plenty of time for questions at the end. As Rick said, please submit them through the question panel, and they'll get them over to me or announce them, and I'll have a chance to answer them at the end. So a little bit about me. As Rick mentioned, I'm CTO of Utopia Solutions. We're a QA and testing focused service provider. Personally, I've been involved in QA and testing for quite a long time, most of that time focused on automation. Certainly over the years, my thoughts on test automation have evolved, but I've over that time developed a deep passion for helping folks implement automation the right way. And really today's talk is about how you can go about finding your right way, because as we'll see, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. I've got my contact information here on the first slide, and I think the last slide as well. So if there's anything that we don't answer, or any thoughts or comments, please reach out. I love talking about this stuff. So I want to start by getting real about automation and cut through all the noise about what the next great tool is, or the next great framework, or whatever your solution of the day might be. And I think a good way to do that is to look at some statistics that are pretty alarming if you consider all the time, money, and effort that is being poured into automation every day. So according to the World Quality Report, the level of automation in general is below 20%. And the context of that statement is that of all the potential testing activities that could be automated, less than 20% of them are. Now, while again, that's a pretty disappointing number considering the vast amount of resources that we all expend, it also points to a huge opportunity, I think. And we'll talk a lot about how to take advantage of those opportunities today. Another statistic in the report also showed that while the level of automation has been an upward trend, the value that we receive in, as an industry from those automation efforts has remained largely unchanged. So even as we pour more and more resources into automation, we're not getting anything more to show for it. And finally, and I couldn't find a reputable published source for this statistic, but it's passed around at conferences and in discussions of people that I talk to all the time, is that 80% of test automation implementations fail. So 8 out of 10 of us on this webinar today are going to fail in our next automation endeavor. And maybe we don't agree with the exact numbers, but I think we can probably all agree that there's a huge opportunity for improvement here. And we can all be a lot better with what we call automation, and that's really the point of what we're going to discuss today. So how did those statistics come about? I'm pretty confident that the perpetuation of automation myths and unrealistic expectations are at least partially to blame. I'm not going to discuss each of these, but one that I see particularly offensive is the thinking that we can automate 100% of our test cases, or really any specific percentage for that matter. We certainly have the typical reasons, right? Not all test cases should be automated, the ROI isn't there, etc. But I think the biggest problem is that this way of thinking sets the primary focus of automation on just automating the execution of test cases. And these test cases are typically at the UI level and are written to be executed by a human. And in my experience, that leads to automating whatever existing test cases you have verbatim, which ultimately ends up with a very maintenance-intensive, UI-centric test suite that is probably likely to collapse under its own weight at some point. So in general, as we'll see, these myths and expectations feed into the way that we think about test automation and lead us to think very narrowly about it, which ultimately ends up and results in a less effective and less efficient solution. So this leads me to a quick exercise. I want everyone to think about the first thing that comes to mind when I say test automation. I believe it's extremely important to have an awareness of what we think test automation is, because as we'll discuss in a lot more detail in a few minutes, our perception of test automation is likely part of the problem if we've experienced failures in our past. So back to my question. Typically, when I ask this question, a vast majority of the answers are focused on a specific tool, specific framework. So if that's where you went, you're certainly not alone. We all have some preconceived notion about what test automation is, and that's the point of this exercise, to recognize that it's very easy for us to let those preconceived notions govern how we approach automation, and ultimately leads to our success. So what is test automation? Let's see if we can break out of those preconceived notions by breaking down the term test automation into the definition of testing and automation. First, looking at this definition of testing, and you may have a better one, but for the purpose of this exercise, we see terms like knowledge, experience, critical thinking, and designing experiments. Is this what we automate when we say automation? Well, of course not, right? So as we just discussed, our preconceived notions of test automation box us into thinking automation is just automating the actions that users perform when they execute tests. Very clearly, we are not automating the testing. And what's more, test automation can be and should be a lot more than just executing user actions. So we'll see that further ahead as well. I also want to mention that the thinking about test automation like this really devalues testing as if it's only executing actions against a UI. For similar reasons, I don't like the term manual testing. I personally think that the term is demeaning to the testing profession. How many times have you heard someone say, I'm just a manual tester? No, you're a tester, and you add a lot more value to the software development process than just executing user actions. So I think we can all be a lot better about our terminology. So let's explore that angle a little bit more. I want to look at what drives how we think about test automation. First, our personal situation. What has worked in the past and also what hasn't. Maybe we were successful with a specific tool or approach or automating a specific type of testing. And on the flip side, maybe we were involved in a failure, and for the same reasons, we're now averse to a specific tool or a specific way of thinking. What our skills are. Maybe the specific tool or approach again. Maybe we know a tool inside and out, or we have a deep development background with a particular language. Maybe we don't have a development background. We prefer a codeless solution. And finally, from a personal perspective, what is our role? Are we part of a test group? Are we a developer? Are we a DevOps engineer? For example, if you come from a system test team or maybe an organization with a centralized test team, you're likely to associate automation with GUI automation tools. If you're a developer, maybe you associate automation more with unit testing or API testing. So certainly our role has an impact. Similarly, our outside influences impact the way we view test automation. We read blogs, listen to webinars like today, we attend conferences, and we all hear wonderful stories about how this tool or that framework or this approach has provided test automation benefits beyond our wildest dreams, and we want that same success. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? We should use our past experience, knowledge, resources to understand and solve the problems that we face. But there's an important caveat, right? We have to first understand the context of the problem before we start solving it. And I think in test automation, a lot of times we don't. We just plow ahead with a solution because we're comfortable with that. And I don't think this happens only with automation, right? Probably for a lot of other things. But here are some examples of answers that I've gotten when I asked organizations what their strategy is for applying automation to testing. And if you read through them very quickly, none of these examples are strategies, right? They're approaches, they're solutions that are born out of someone's preconceived notions that have prevented them ultimately from seeing the details of the problem that they're trying to solve. All these answers came before they even started to develop a plan or a strategy for automation. This was just their kind of pound their fist on the desk and state how they're going to implement automation. And it's not just the automation approach or implementation that's impacted by this way of thinking. It's everything we do and think about with respect to automation, the potential benefits, what our expectations about the effort and cost are, even in the job descriptions we use to hire automation resources. And that narrow way of thinking then breeds more of the same and really starts a pandemic of thinking very narrowly about what test automation is, and that is just continually perpetuated. So before I talk about how we might address the issue, let's maybe take a look at why software testers as a group, myself included, might think so narrowly about test automation. And from my experience, there are a handful of reasons. First, it's human nature for most of us to want to stay in our comfort zone. Certainly thinking or doing what we've done in the past, thinking about our existing knowledge or existing experience qualifies as being comfortable, right? We've done it before, we know it, it makes sense to us. Similarly, it's also human nature to fear the unknown. Do we as a group want to take on the professional risk, or at least the perceived risk, associated with trying something new and different? Along those same lines, there's a lot as a group that we don't know. And I'm sure we would all love to spend our days researching and learning new things, but as we know, that doesn't necessarily support the business objectives of the organizations that employ us. Certainly a lot of us are under pressure from the organization that may have standardized on a particular tool or a certain approach. And many times it's just the inertia of, hey, we've always done things this way, that becomes very difficult to overcome. And of course, I think we have ourselves to blame. Again, we listen to webinars, we come to conferences, we talk about what we've done and the benefits we've realized, and those stories make us feel good, so naturally we want to duplicate that. Certainly doesn't help that we're also egged on by the tool vendors to approach things in a way that aligns with their messaging, but may not be aligned very well at all with the problem that we're trying to solve. I also think that as a group, we have a generally narrow view of software testing. Certainly not all of us, but I do often encounter a view of testing being very limited to, again, creating test cases designed to be executed against a UI. And that's certainly part of testing, but it's also not the whole of software testing. So I think we spent enough time now talking about how we got to where we are in thinking narrowly about automation. And I want to dive into what we can do about it. So the first thing I think we need to do is change our perspective. Oh, went one too far, sorry. It's to change our perspective of how we approach automation. And the first thing we can do there is to start to develop some foundational thought processes that promote a more open way to think about it. The first one is a realization that just because something has worked in the past doesn't mean it's the right solution for the next problem or your next automation opportunity. Should it be considered? Maybe, but you don't know that until you fully understand the problem that you're trying to solve. Next, and this is a big one, avoid the temptation of what industry best practices tell us to do. What's best for one group in their situation doesn't mean it's the best situation for another group, even sometimes when it looks like a similar situation, right? Rather, each particular situation, there are certainly appropriate practices. I'm certainly not saying we should ignore what we generally refer to as industry best practices. We can learn from that. We can gain knowledge from that. I'm just saying let's avoid the urge to blindly apply those solutions without understanding their appropriateness first. Another important one is again, the fear of the unknown or trying something new. And we really need to start thinking differently about that. Many times when I'm talking to a group about why they use a specific tool or approach, the reason boils down to an aversion of doing things differently, because just because they know how to do something, and even sometimes if they also realize it's probably not the best fit, they'll push ahead. But it's extremely important to realize that it's okay to try and fail, maybe multiple times, if you're learning something new and you're moving ahead through those failures. If we borrow a concept from agile processes, right? As long as we're failing quickly, we're gaining knowledge that's helping us to get better. And if you think about all the epic failures that people talk about with test automation, the potential benefit of the new approach probably outweighs the risk, right? Again, as long as you're failing quickly, realizing and learning from those failures and moving on. Lastly, and closely related to the previous one, is an acceptance that there's nothing wrong with learning something new. Might be a new tool, a utility, a programming language, if it's the most appropriate solution. And I realize there's a huge amount of inertia, as well as external forces working against this one, right? We all have work to do, we all have deadlines, but let's balance that against the time, effort, and ultimately money that will be lost if you fail doing something that is ultimately wrong for your particular situation. And thinking back to those statistics we talked about at the beginning, the odds aren't with you if you just plot ahead with what you're comfortable with or what you already know without understanding that problem. So it's definitely worth a look into new things and new ways of thinking to avoid those statistics, and B, get the benefits that we're all looking for with respect to automation. So once you've changed your thought processes and opened up your mind a bit to how you think about automation, I think the next step is to broaden our definition of it. And one of the best ways I've found to do this is to think about all the activities that you perform that are related to software testing. And you'll quickly see that you do a lot of things that have nothing at all to do with executing test cases against the UI. And here's a list of a few things I put together. And again, you'll get access to the recording and the slides later, so no need to read the eye chart. But what's important to realize that all these things can be automated in one way or another. Can we use a GUI automation tool like Selenium or UFT to automate all these things? No, or at least we could probably all agree that they wouldn't be the most effective or efficient way to automate a lot of these activities. So by broadening our definition and thinking more generally about test automation, we can now not only identify more opportunities to benefit from automation, but it should, as we'll see here in the next few slides, allow us to perform that automation in a way that gives us the most benefits. It's not just the way that's the most comfortable for us. So we just looked at that long list of activities that we could or may perform as part of testing. I want to talk about how we can identify those opportunities to benefit from automation. And the first and probably the most difficult thing that we need to do is suppress our urge to immediately start solving the problem using whatever our current body of experience and knowledge happens to be. That's certainly very important, very valuable, but it's also self-limiting if we put those blinders on and only view the world from that perspective. If we call that experience and knowledge our hammer, then we need to resist that urge to see every potential automation opportunity only as a nail. And I think we've all probably heard of the hammer and nail analogy applied in similar contexts. So next, you need to think about the frequency, the effort, the time, and duration associated with all those activities that you've put together as part of what you do in the world of software testing. And you want to identify those activities that are costing us the most in terms of those metrics. And I don't think this has to be a large intensive research project, most of the data is probably right there in front of you. It may be more qualitative than quantitative, but you need to identify it and you need to capture it. And you also want to look at value add activities that maybe you aren't doing but could or should be performing if you had more time or more bandwidth. And this is an often overlooked benefit to automation. I find there's often a lot of high priority activity that isn't performed because there just isn't enough time. So what happens sometimes is lower priority activities that just happen to fit in the available time are moved up in priority and just because they're less time and less effort intensive. Is it right? No, but unfortunately, it's a reality that I see quite often. So once you have all those opportunities, rank them in terms of impact to your organizations, and typically that's going to be the potential time or effort saved. And this serves as your initial priority list, and it certainly might change once you start to investigate each of them a little more, but that's okay, right? We're not trying to solve the problem yet. We've still got our hammer locked in our toolbox. And you're likely to have a decent list of opportunities if you open up your mind a little bit. And I'm not naive to think that organizations can stop what they're doing completely and investigate this long list of automation opportunities. But if you're really serious about wanting the benefits of automation, you should be able to start with the highest priority and then work your way down. And I've got some examples at the end that shows how a couple organizations went through that process. And I think you'll see that this isn't a stop the presses, everyone spends months figuring out what to do and then restarts it again. It's something much smaller and much more consumable than that. So if now you have a list of potential opportunities to apply automation to, next we need to think about how we think about test automation tools, right? We don't just want to take out our hammer and start pounding. We really need to open up our definition, not just what automation is, what activities can be automated, but how we think about tools. So similar to what we did with the term automation, I want you to think about the first thing that comes to mind when I say test automation tools. My guess is that most of you thought about one of the commercial or open source GUI automation tools, Selenium, UFT, whatever your tool of choice might be. And if so, you're not alone. But the problem with that thinking is that, again, common theme here, it leads us to generally narrowing the definition of automation to automatically performing UI level actions in order to meet whatever our test objectives happen to be. All right, and that leads us down the path further to creating large, unwieldy, extremely difficult to maintain UI level automated test suites. So you end up as an organization spending an enormous amount of time, energy, and ultimately money doing the same thing over and over again with little more to show for it. So this next slide, I've listed, I put together a start of a list anyway that we can consider to be testing tools. Again, don't need you to read it right now. We'll point you to it afterwards. But as you can see, GUI automation software is in there, and I purposefully kind of hit it in the middle to make a point. And the point is, anything you can use or possibly build to make a testing-related activity more efficient or more effective is a testing tool. And really the underlying message here is don't assume that whatever your existing or your favorite solution is what should be used. And certainly don't try to force it to be the solution to your problem. And as we'll see in one of the examples, that can be a disaster. Rather, I want you to step back and take some time to understand the opportunity more deeply and determine first if it warrants automation, right? The typical criteria, is it time-consuming, tedious, error-prone, etc. Assuming that it does, then think about how to best apply automation And don't just rely on your own experience and expertise, right? It's okay to discuss the problem with colleagues to identify possible options as well. Granted, it can be hard to break out of your comfort zone, both individually and as an organization. But if the best option requires you to learn something new, that's not necessarily a bad thing, as we talked about before. Right? Not only do you take advantage of the opportunity for automation, but both the individual and the organization have grown. And there's more than one way to skin that cat, right? Maybe there's someone in the organization that can be borrowed, possibly short-term contractor, or other methods to get the skills you need to best identify the problem. But that's a business problem, right? And organizations have ways of solving business problems, especially if they can see significant benefit. So again, don't narrow your definition or your thinking process just to what we already know, or don't be afraid to try something new. As we'll see in those examples, starting right here, the benefits can be significant. So we've been talking pretty conceptually so far. So before we wrap up, I wanted to give you a couple of concrete examples of how the way we approach automation, either from a very narrow view or a more general context-driven view, has a profound impact on the result. This first one is testing an application for the electrical retrofit industry. At a very high level, application involves resources walking through large commercial or industrial buildings with a tablet-based app and creating audits of all the electrical fixtures for the purpose of eventually quoting a complete replacement. The audit info is transferred to the quoting app via JSON files. The quoting app then generates quotes, again in the form of JSON files, which are ultimately viewed on a desktop browser. Given the wide range of building sizes, types, and a significant number of different quote configurations, this group had identified a suite of quoting engine regression tests that they estimated would require about 1,600 hours to execute by humans. So obviously automation was attractive to them because there's no way that they could, it wasn't feasible for them to execute that much regression testing. As you can imagine from the pictures, the UIs for both the mobile app and viewing the quote on the browser were extremely complex. Now, unfortunately, the project team had some prior Selenium experience, and they were about to head down their hammer and nail path by automating the audit creation through the mobile app UI and then verifying the quotes through the desktop UI. And without hesitation, I can tell you that would have ended extremely badly. The only question in my mind was how much time and money were they going to spend before they realized they needed to abandon the effort. So their hammer and nail approach there was start with the users on the mobile end and then validate with the users on the browser end. But before they had started that, we suggested that they take a step back and look at the problem they were trying to solve, which in this case was execute a large volume of regression tests on the quoting engine in a reasonable amount of time. The objectives really didn't, at least these objectives, didn't cover the mobile UI or the browser UI. And once they took that perspective, it was much easier for them to start breaking that problem down into more consumable chunks and begin to develop a solution to that problem. Ultimately, they built a utility that generated a set of JSON audit files that represented that large set of test conditions. That same utility ingested those audit files and then configured the quoting options via a REST API. And then finally, the utility validated the resulting quote files. They happened, in this case, they built that utility in Python. And interestingly enough, not because it was some best practice they had read about, but because the test team possessed Python expertise, it was certainly suitable for building this utility. So they could create that solution versus waiting for some outside assistance to help them. So not only did they apply automation in a specific way that made the most sense for their application and their testing objectives, they used the technology that made the most sense for them given their resources and skills. Um, this entire solution was built in about a month by a single resource, and had they gone down their hammer and nail approach, it would have been several resources for several months, and again, I believe that they ultimately would have failed. So that was a glaring success for them, right? But does that mean we should run out and learn how to parse JSON with Python? Well, of course not, right? But we can learn something about the process they took to turn that opportunity into success. And I'm not expecting you to, again, read this eye chart now, again, mostly here as a reference for you after the fact. But what's here is a slightly paraphrased version of the plan that they put together. And it's important to notice this wasn't a complex project plan, and they did this with a relatively small effort. It took a very agile approach, breaking the development of that utility into smaller increments and having a clearly defined goal for each one of them. They managed the tasks out of Jira in this case. And again, the core solution was ultimately completed in about a month. So when I say we need to identify opportunities and put together a strategy, understand I'm not talking about huge side projects, right? And I don't think you even need to be this formal about it, truthfully. But the key is to understand that opening up your horizons with regards to how you think about automation will really take those blinders off and lead to better solutions and more importantly, more success. Now, I want to take a look at one more example, and this one is a great example of what I'm talking about in terms of how the hammer and nail approach ultimately leads to failed implementations. We weren't involved in this project, but a colleague of mine shared this experience when I had asked her for some advice on validating data visualizations a while back. The background here is that this was a big data app. It took in marketing data from multiple sources, processed it, and then presented it to the end users to help them understand the effectiveness of their marketing campaigns and for planning future marketing efforts. That data was ultimately presented to the end user via complex visualizations, so charts and graphs. She had been called in to help after the company's automation team, who had a long history of GUI-based automation, had failed with their hammer. And I've got a short synopsis there of the process they went through. But because they were so ingrained in their thinking about automation, they only saw solutions that involved automating the user actions against the UI as they had done for many years. The problem was doing this with very visual applications, among other things, and as I'm sure many of you know, very difficult, if not impossible, with GUI automation tools. But yet they tried and failed not once, but several times with their hammer. They did finally succeed, though, by taking a context-driven approach. My colleague had helped them figure out the problem they were trying to solve, which in this case was determining if the data was processed correctly, ultimately. And once they understood that, again, there was a relatively clear direction they needed to proceed to determine if this was a good candidate to apply automation to. And from there, they followed a logical series of steps to implement the solution. To highlight the dramatic impact that these different approaches can have, so the hammer and nail approach, they had several resources, had spent over 6 months trying and ultimately failing with their test automation hammer. Right? The final solution was implemented by a single resource in about 4 weeks, and that 4 weeks includes the time they took to figure out the problem in the first place. So now they have a repeatable automation solution developed with a relatively small effort that had replaced a failed effort that took an effort of well over a year, total effort of well over a year. And the difference in those results had nothing to do with the tool, had nothing to do even with the resources, because the successful result was developed by one of the existing team that had failed. The only difference was they stepped back and they understood the problem, and they took their blinders off in terms of what they had always used in the past. And as you can see, a dramatic difference in the outcome. So before we open up for questions, I want to summarize some of the key takeaways that we just from the topics we just discussed. First and foremost, when you see automation myths being perpetuated or others having unrealistic expectations, call them out. And I'm not saying that you have to get in their face and tell them they're wrong. Even something as simple as, I've heard that there are different ways to think about that. Maybe we should discuss it before we push ahead. I find a lot when I'm talking to organizations about building a strategy for test automation that there's people in the organizations that had questions about what they have done in the past, and they just didn't speak up because maybe they felt they didn't have the right experience or their role didn't call for that. But as a whole, I think if we do speak up and we do our part in stopping the perpetuation of myths and the unrealistic expectations, we'll go a long way to getting this process of opening up the way of thinking and being more context-driven about test automation. The next one is certainly often easier said than done, but as we talked about, change the way you think about automation. Again, okay to try new things, and realize you don't have to be perfect at them, or you don't have to necessarily see the outcome before you get started. Next, and especially if your experience with automation is limited to GUI automation tools, broaden that definition. The best way to do that, again, is to think about all the activities you perform as part of testing, not just executing test steps. This will lead you to identify your opportunities, many more opportunities for automation. And finally, don't blindly forge ahead with a solution you've used in the past before you understand the problem you're trying to solve, right? Understand that context. If you want to be context-driven, you have to understand the context. So let's open it up to questions, Rick. Hopefully we have a few.
We do have a few, as a matter of fact. Thank you very much for that presentation, Lee. It was very informative, and I've got a few questions here. One person asked, will the slides be available after the presentation?
Well, they will be. I think you're going to send out a link to the recording, and then I will send out a hard copy of the slides to all that attended as well.
Great. Thank you very much. And that answers one of the other questions too. Someone's asking again about the recording. We will make this available, the recording, so you guys will receive that. One question that came up here is, what are the challenges that you have faced when people are trying to get a very small QA team on board with the idea of automation, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, so in this case, right, size always matters, right? So it really comes down to how much you can bite off. If you look at all the different opportunities that you have, right, so kind of go back to that concept, I find when especially smaller QA teams get stuck, it's because they're looking at maybe this huge regression test or some other huge test suite, and said, well, how are we going to automate that? We have to continually execute it, and we have to build automation at the same time. But if they thought about all the activities they performed, a lot of times, a good amount of the time they spend regression testing is actually setting up the data, and maybe that's a more easier chunk to bite off from automation. Maybe it's a situation where you can bring in an outside organization to kickstart that process if you don't have the bandwidth initially to get it off the ground. But yes, the small organizations, especially if they're looking at a large regression test suite, sometimes get stuck and don't even take the first step because of it. If they can look at other opportunities to start to identify benefits from automation, then show and publish those benefits and the successes and say, hey, if we had more resources, if we had more bandwidth, we could extend these benefits even further. So great question.
Okay. The next question looks like it's more of a kind of a technical question to either one of your examples. Why didn't they use Excel or CSV file to define data? It will be familiar with the manual tester instead of JSON.
So, well, in the interest of time, I left that out. They actually did use Excel. So the utility they built had to create JSON files because that's what was ingested by the quoting engine. But that utility was configurable, right? It took information from spreadsheets, which essentially defined the different information that they wanted those audit files to contain, and it sucked that information out of the Excel files, and then put them in the right format, the right JSON format, and create the JSON file. So that's a very good question. I just didn't include the whole solution in the interest of time. But yes, that utility was configurable. So they defined what they wanted, all the different audit files and what they wanted them to contain in Excel files, and then the utility ingested that and created the audit files in the format that the quoting engine could ingest. Good question.
Okay. This might be a follow-on to that very question, but about the solution to verify the tooltip when hovering the mouse over the chart by extracting the data directly from the DOM and validate. How can you make sure that the tooltip displays on the screen successfully when you're hovering the mouse to the chart?
So that's a very important question. So they did have test cases to validate the tooltips, but what they were just validating the mechanics of the UI, right? Not necessarily that all the different quotes that were generated were being displayed correctly through the tooltips, because that became very, well, ultimately led to failure. That became very effort intensive. They found situations that they had difficulty getting the tooltips to display. Some types of charts and graphs didn't have tooltips. So the reason they took the approach was based on their test objective was, is this quoting engine doing its job? And what they ultimately found was that the data that the quoting engine was spewing out, actually, this is the other example. So in this case, it was the data processing that the big data engine was spewing out. That data was displayed or contained in the DOM and then used by the drawing libraries to create those charts and graphs. So they did still test the tooltips, but they didn't use the tooltips to test all the different combinations and permutations of the data that was coming out of that big data app. And that's an important technique, I think, as well. Think about the different types of test cases. Do you have UI test cases? Absolutely. Should you verify that the mechanics of the UI are working? Absolutely. But is the UI the best way to verify different types of test cases? Maybe, again, the data processing related test cases and other things. In most cases, probably not, right? And we've probably all at some point heard the concept about the test automation pyramid. And we can argue whether or not it should be a pyramid or some other shape, but the idea is your UI tests should be at the top, and they should be only the tests that you have to execute through the UI, a smallest set as possible, because they're the most expensive and to create and maintain. So if you end up creating or executing all your test cases independent of what they're trying to test through the UI, you're going to end up with a very difficult to and expensive solution to maintain.
Okay. A couple comments from Wayne. He says, tooltips, we used eggplant to visualize GUIs. And then he says, not just the DOM, but what actually the user sees. So I think he's kind of commenting as you're answering that question.
Yep, absolutely. And in this, I'm not terribly intimate with exactly what they did, but the way we would approach that, again, we want to verify what the user sees. But there, in this case, there was hundreds, maybe even thousands of test cases related to the different ways data could be processed. And from a UI mechanics or how that data got to the end user perspective, we didn't need to verify all hundreds or thousands of combinations of permutations through the UI. We verified that the information, whatever that was, got to the UI correctly, and we tested that thoroughly, or we should test that thoroughly. But again, there's another set of combinations and permutations of test cases at the data level that don't necessarily need to be verified through the UI. But yes, very good points.
Okay, a couple more questions. This one I thought was pretty interesting. There are multiple frameworks and tools. How do you challenge an automation team management that only wants to use UFT? I use shell scripts that are very mature, but I'm getting pushed to convert in some way.
Yeah, well, again, right? So you've got that organizational inertia of, hey, we've always done it this way, or they see the money they initially invested for the tool, and they see the support and maintenance that they pay every year, and they want that to be used. There's nothing wrong with UFT as a tool, but right, it's very much focused on the UI layer. There is a service component to it as well. But what you need to do is look at the problem you're trying to solve and very clearly explain why there are better ways to solve that problem. If you're testing the mechanics of the UI, there's probably nothing wrong with UFT if it supports your solution. But if you're trying to verify, maybe create some data, or you're trying to verify things at a different layer or a way that UFT doesn't support, you need to explain that and that, hey, I realize you spent some money on this tool, but if we use it, you're going to spend a lot more maintaining the solution than if we just did it with the tools and the utilities that make sense for this problem. So it's if you put it in terms of, yeah, I can use your investment to do this, but it's ultimately going to require you to invest a whole lot more than if we just use the right tool that's available to us, and most importantly, appropriate for this particular situation.
Okay. I think one last question here we'll take. Excellent presentation. Our QA department shares many of your approaches. What are some effective strategies to get the management on board with them? If management thinks that testing is just something that happens after development with little interest in improving process.
Well, it sounds like there's bigger fish to fry there than just just automation. I think if they view testing that way, they're probably looking for ways to decrease their cost, decrease the duration, decrease the cycle times. And I think that's where you start to bring these approaches in that you guys already, it sounds like you have the same thought processes on, and say, look, yes, maybe testing is something we do at the end of development, but we can improve on that. And if you can use some of these approaches to improve at least what their perspective of testing is, and get some wins, then you'll have more success, I think, frying that bigger fish, that more important fish, which is getting them to have a little bit more respect for software testing in general. I think if you the easier answer would be to start to address that bigger problem first. Sounds like maybe you probably tried that and haven't had success. So, applying some of these approaches to get some small wins, show some improvements in terms of testing duration, cycle time, effort, and then say, hey, we had some success here. We'd like to also try this, and maybe start to get address some of the more upstream problems in terms of how testing is thought of in general.
All right, 2 more questions came in, then we can wrap it up. Let's see here. How do you take a call on how much testing via API versus UI? Because UI is still an important piece, and that is how end users interact.
So again, I like to split up the test cases into verifying the mechanics of the UI, because yes, right, it doesn't do us any good if the information makes it is spit out by the APIs correctly, but something that happens between there and the user's eyes that that presents the information incorrectly or not at all. So we like to isolate the mechanics of the user interface, right? What are all the different ways the information is being kind of input into the UI and then presented, and those are our UI test cases. Maybe they're manual, maybe they're automated, depending on the situation. And then, you know, what we test for the API is specific to what the APIs are doing. And typically, we have many more test cases at the API level because there's just more combinations and permutations in terms of the inputs and the potential outputs. Right? I could have what could be 100 different test cases comes out of the API, but the way they're ultimately displayed to the end user is through, you know, data in a table. So I don't need to test all the 100 combinations and permutations of how the data got into that table. From the UI perspective, I may be testing, hey, is the data empty in the table? Is it, you know, greater than the whatever the boundary is in terms of how much data that table can hold? Does it scroll correctly, et cetera, right? So I'm really, I call it distilling my test cases into things that target the UI and the mechanics of the UI, separate from targeting the other layers. So I don't get kind of trapped into or led down the path of verifying everything through the UI. Certainly not suggesting you ignore the UI, just that you use the UI only for testing what makes sense to be tested through the UI. I think we've probably all seen examples of applications that don't have a very good API layer, or maybe don't have one at all. And we're forced to do testing through the UI. Then we have to be really careful about what we automate, and we make sure that we can see the benefit, and we can we're not going down a path that ultimately is going to fail because we're trying to automate something that's just too complex for whatever tool we have.
That's kind of interesting. This last the last one I saw here is the automation we use in our organizations need to test both UI and microservices built for data flow from one system to the next. And I believe we've developed to support your organization's needs. Just wondering where we stand on that approach.
So I think, by the way, it was written, I understand what's going on. So I think I maybe best to answer it by the way we would approach that. So you've got data flowing across systems. Again, we'll, you know, by taking that approach of testing that the individual UIs work correctly, separate from the data flowing through those systems. If you've got microservices or service layer that you can use to test the data flow, you're likely going to have many more test cases at that level than you are at the UI. At the UI level, I think that's if I understood the question or the statement correctly, I think that's a great approach.
Well, Lee, I think we've come to the end of the questions. I appreciate that. Those were pretty rapid fire coming in there. It was a great webinar, lots of good information. Again, folks, we did have a few more questions on here that they would like the recording and the slides. We will be sending that out in the next couple of days to everyone, so just look in your email. The email that you use to register for this webinar is where you will receive the information. We should have the recording up by at least Friday morning, so take a look at that. Another gentleman asked, what will be some the next webinars to follow up and reinforce content from this one. If you keep your eye on softwaretestpro.com/training, or if you've signed up on our lists that will provide you email notification of actual webinars that are coming up. We have a webinar notification email list that you can sign up on Software Test Pro. That will give you a little bit more information of what webinars are coming up and what their topics are and everything like that. So speaking of that, one more webinar that's coming up, again, just a reminder, performance engineering with James Pulley. We will have all that information up on the website as soon as we receive it from James, and we will send out a notification through Twitter as well, through our email address as well. And don't forget to check out STPCon coming to the Washington, D.C. metro area from October 22nd through the 25th. So Lee, again, I really appreciate your time. Got a lot of other really good comments here that I answered, people saying what great content to discuss amongst your teams and those kind of things. So I think the attendees really got a lot out of the actual webinar today, and thank you.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for attending.
All right, folks, well, this ends today's webinar. Again, I appreciate everyone attending, and we look forward to seeing you on the next STP community webinar. Thank you very much.